Let me begin with the Islamic reading. Assalamu alaikum. Wishing you peace and wholeness. I hope you don't mind that I will be reading my paper instead of speaking to you more directly. This is partly because I want to ensure that I'm able to say everything that I intend to say within the allotted time. The topic of this seminar, the kinship in thought between Islam and the West, may appear rather modest, even innocent, but in my view it is extremely ambitious in its significance. The reason I find this topic ambitious, in the positive sense of the word, is twofold. There are many people today, all around the world, who claim and believe that no kinship actually exists between Islam and the West, particularly in the area of thought. And second, these same people are likely to act in ways that most of us will find troublesome, if not outright dangerous and even reprehensible. Given this state of affairs, anything we can do to show that the truth is otherwise, that a significant amount of kinship does exist between Islam and the West, will be a valuable service. I'm going to make a few remarks on each of the 4 key terms that appear in the topic: thought, kinship, Islam, the West. First, what we call thought typically arises in response to a problem and aims at solving it. We become aware of a problem when we experience feelings of unhappiness, discomfort, or irritation. Such negative or undesirable feelings indicate that some need of ours is not being met. An unfulfilled need is another name for the problem. And a problem is precisely what stimulates thought. If we agree that the purpose of thought is to solve problems, that is, to help us meet our unfulfilled needs, and thereby overcome our feelings of unhappiness, discomfort, or irritation, then we have a reasonable standard for judging the value of any given thought. Insofar as a particular thought is able to help us address the problem at hand, we may identify that thought as true. Insofar as a particular thought is not able to help us address the problem, or makes it even worse, we may describe that thought as false. The second key term is kinship. What we call kinship indicates a relation of continuity and overlap. A kinship in thought implies the emergence of a similar or identical thought in 2 different contexts. This may be due to coincidence, similarity of circumstances, borrowing, derivation from a single source, or some combination of these factors. The third key word is Islam. Unfortunately, the word Islam has come to carry so many different meanings that I cannot possibly untangle all of them in a couple of minutes. But regardless of how we define Islam, one thing is certain: it is not a monolithic and unchanging entity that speaks with a single voice. The same is true of the 4th key term, the West. This too can have a variety of different meanings. Just as Islam is not one thing, neither is the West. For the limited purposes of the present discussion, we may take these 2 terms, Islam and the West, as very approximate ways of signifying 2 social and cultural contexts that have relatively fuzzy boundaries. In this background, when we talk about a kinship in thought between Islam and the West, we cannot possibly mean that Islam as one entity and the West as another entity are somehow similar. We can only mean that some specific elements of Islam are similar to some specific elements of the West. To be more precise, we are talking about a similarity or continuity or overlap, otherwise known as kinship, between a set of thoughts emerging in Islam and a set of thoughts emerging in the West, where both Islam and the West are conceived as social and cultural contexts. As I've suggested, the demonstration of such kinship is a positive and much needed service in view of the contemporary state of affairs. Almost 20 years ago, an American historian historian of Islam, Professor Bernard Lewis, published an essay in which he explained the causes behind what he believed was a global wave of anti-Western anger among Muslims. I'll quote two sentences from that essay. This is Professor Bernard Lewis. It should by now be clear that we are facing a mood and a movement far transcending the level of issues and policies and the governments that pursue them. This is no less than a clash of civilizations, the perhaps irrational but surely historic reaction of an ancient rival against our Judeo-Christian heritage, our secular present, and the worldwide expansion of both. End of quote. This essay was widely read, but Clash of Civilizations did not immediately become a household phrase. It rose to prominence when, less than 3 years later, an American political scientist, Professor Samuel Huntington, published an essay explaining the geopolitics of the post-Cold War world in terms of warring civilizations. Here's a quote from that essay. Conflict along the fault lines between Western and Islamic civilizations has been going on for 1,300 years. This centuries-old military interaction between the West and Islam is unlikely to decline. It could become more virulent. End of quote. Now, both Lewis and Huntington spoke in their respective essays as defenders and representatives of something they called the West. As you might expect, at least a section of Muslims agrees with them. They too make the same claim, except that they speak as defenders and representatives of something they call Islam. So let me quote one Muslim opinion. I say that the West's occupation of our country is old yet new, and that the confrontation and conflict between us and them started centuries ago. This confrontation and conflict will go on because the conflict between truth and falsehood will continue until Judgment Day. I don't know if you recognize this, but this last statement is from Osama bin Laden. Now, obviously, the three individuals I have quoted are coming from very different backgrounds, yet there is an uncanny similarity in their respective styles of reasoning. Each of them assumes that there is a single entity called the West, and that this entity is in a state of conflict or warfare with another entity called Islam. In this viewpoint, Islam and the West are separate and distinct things with no overlap between them, no common grounds, no kinship. In fact, the conflict or warfare between the two sides is precisely due to the fact that they are mutually exclusive. They are rivals or competitors because they are both seeking the same prize, world domination, the very nature of which precludes any negotiation, sharing, or compromise. It is further assumed that only one of these two sides is valid and true, which requires the other side to either submit or cease to exist. In effect, Islam and the West are locked together in a centuries-old struggle for survival and domination that can only end in a scenario where one side wins and the other loses. Needless to say, this viewpoint is more prevalent than we would like to see. And it is probably as common among Muslims as it is common among non-Muslims. Equally obvious is the fact that there is something profoundly wrong with this viewpoint. For those who adopt it tend to act in ways that increase human suffering rather than decreasing it. In the Clash of Civilizations thesis, we have an example of a thought whose adherents are found in both Islam and the West. Yet, this is not the kind of kinship that we find very desirable. It does not solve problems, but is itself a problem that needs to be solved. It does not help meet our needs, but is itself a hindrance that prevents us from meeting our needs. It is true that the Clash of Civilizations thesis has, over the years, received a close and extensive scrutiny from a wide variety of scholars who have fully exposed its numerous flaws and weaknesses. The problem, however, is that academic criticisms of the Clash of Civilizations thesis have not reduced the number of people who either subscribe to this viewpoint or are likely to find it attractive and believable. Even though the thesis has been analyzed, critiqued, and rejected by some of the most knowledgeable people in disciplines like political science, history, Islamic studies, and so on, it continues to inform the thinking and policies of some of the most powerful and our most desperate individuals across the globe. What I would like to know is, what is it that causes a flawed and inaccurate belief to have such a pervasive influence across cultures? Why is it, if the Clash of Civilizations thesis has been deconstructed a million times, that it continues to incarnate itself in true believers who are willing to shape the world according to its mandate? The answer to this puzzle, in my opinion, is that academic criticisms have very effectively refuted the Clash of Civilizations thesis itself, but they have done very little to address the style of reasoning that underlies this thesis and that continues to provide it with an aura of plausibility. In fact, individuals like Bernard Lewis, Samuel Huntington, and Osama bin Laden represent the least of our problems. They or their ideas are not as troublesome as the style of reasoning that all three seem to employ when they make their arguments. So long as this particular reasoning style is not identified and critiqued, the notion of the Clash of Civilizations will not go away. Instead, it will keep raising its nefarious head in a variety of different disguises. In fact, so long as the underlying style of reasoning remains unconscious, it will continue to produce or empower not just one, but a whole range of problematic ideas, leading to varying degrees of human suffering. Now, I'm going to say something in the next few minutes that may give you the impression that I'm going off topic. So, I would like to say that there's no need to worry about that. I'm not going off topic. I'm just taking a detour and I'm going to come back. So just stay with me. Some of you may have heard an expression. This used to be considered a Chinese saying, but now nobody knows really where it came from. It goes like this: may you live in interesting times. This is usually thought to be a curse that is disguised as a blessing. May you live in interesting times basically means may you face lots of problems and have a very busy, active life in dealing with those. But given that challenges and difficulties, as Iqbal would say, are the necessary prerequisites for human growth, I am willing to admit or acknowledge that perhaps this is a blessing disguised as a curse. Now, while many of us may feel that our own everyday lives are often dull and boring, it will take only a moment's reflection to realize that humanity as a whole is going through some extremely interesting times. All we need to do is take a few steps back from our everyday existence and try to imagine the big picture, the larger context within which all of us exist as almost negligible beings. From that viewpoint, we may come to notice that the 10,000-year experiment called civilization is going through a crucial phase in its history. Depending on how this crucial phase plays itself out, civilization, as we know it, may or may not survive. Once we have noticed how fragile things really are, it becomes difficult to view our world, including our otherwise boring individual lives, as anything less than interesting. Now, you may have noticed that I'm using the word civilization in the singular, as opposed to the concept I just discussed, Clash of Civilizations, which uses this concept in the plural. I don't deny that there had existed in the world a variety of different civilizations, but I'm not sure if this way of understanding the world has the same usefulness today as it is for understanding the past. Human beings, Homo sapiens, have been living and thriving on Earth for at least 200,000 years, possibly more. However, the specific form of cultural and social organization that we call civilization is barely 10,000 years old. It's a very small fraction of human existence on Earth. In his book, A Short History of Progress, Canadian author Ronald Wright defines civilization as a specific kind of culture that is characterized by a large and complex society based on the domestication of plants, animals, and humans, and typically involving towns, cities, governments, social classes, and specialized professions. Ronald Wright uses the word civilization in the singular. He implies, correctly I think, that in the present moment the entire humanity basically finds itself in the same boat. It is absurd to talk about one civilization coming to dominate another, or one civilization surviving the challenges while others facing doom and destruction. Whatever cultural differences may exist today, contemporary challenges are characterized by the intertwining of the local and the global in such a way that their mutual differences are becoming less and less relevant. Consequently, and as a matter of practical reason, we must learn to imagine humanity as part of a single civilization, which as a whole is going through a crucial phase in its history. Ronald Wright argues that depending on how things turn out, it is human civilization as such, and not this or that civilization, that will either survive or fail to survive. Why is human civilization under threat? It seems that there are three fundamental problems or challenges that together constitute this threat. These are political and economic inequality, environmental destruction, and violent conflict. All three are the inevitable outcome of the same logic that makes the very project of civilization possible. In its initial stages, civilization gave rise to these problems at a relatively small scale. As it continued to spread and grow over the subsequent millennia, these problems continue to increase in complexity and scale. Modernity, through its institutionalization of secularism and capitalism, as well as science and technology, was once believed to possess the capacity for reducing and even eliminating these problems. The results, however, have been disappointing. During the last 2 centuries or so, there has been an unusually rapid increase in the efficiency and effectiveness with which human beings are able to control and manipulate the world. While this has led to many desirable results, there has also been a corresponding increase in the complexity and scale of the three main problems that threaten civilization. It seems that with every gain we make in the direction of progress, the crisis of civilization becomes more serious and more acute. Now, the other thing about these particular problems is that they're universal problems. They affect human individuals and communities all over the globe. One requires a human and a planetary viewpoint in order to recognize them as the most pressing issues that are threatening civilization. In contrast, a viewpoint informed by our commitment to a particular nation state, an ethnicity, a race, or a religious community will usually help us identify problems that are most relevant to that particular object of our loyalty. Such a parochial viewpoint generates a competitive attitude that may help solve some problems in one part of the world, while disregarding, or what is more often the case, worsening the same or another problem in the rest of the world. By definition, a parochial viewpoint does not take the entire system into account. Instead, it only allows us to see particular aspects of the system as if they existed and functioned in isolation from the whole. Consequently, our efforts at establishing order in one part of the system inevitably produces an increase in chaos in a different part of the system. Most cultures have been able to disregard the reality of our deep interconnectedness for several thousand years, but that attitude can no longer be maintained. And that's the end of my detour. I'm now back on track. Well, I never left the track, in case you were that there is a need for a universal and human viewpoint in order to address the kind of challenges that are threatening the viability of civilization itself. This is what makes Iqbal supremely relevant. Among modern Muslim thinkers, Iqbal stands out as one of the first to recognize the need for a human and planetary perspective. He is also one of the first to recognize the nature and seriousness of the contemporary crisis of civilization. While he thinks and writes and speaks as a committed Muslim, and also as an Indian, deep down he is a citizen of the world. Iqbal sets for himself and for his followers the task of what he calls the Reconstruction. And by that he means specifically the reconstruction of Islamic thought, Islamic self, Islamic community, and Islamic institutions. Yet, he does not conceive of this task of reconstruction in parochial or competitive terms. Instead, he believes that an Islamic reconstruction is the necessary prelude for saving human civilization from its own suicidal tendencies. In Iqbal's own words, humanity needs three things today: a spiritual interpretation of the universe, the spiritual emancipation of the individual, and basic principles of a universal import directing the evolution of human society on a spiritual basis. And notice that he uses the word humanity rather than Muslims or Indians or Asians. For Iqbal, the modern relevance of Islam stems from the fact that Muslims possess a living revelation in the form of the Quran, which offers them precisely what humanity as a whole needs today with an unprecedented urgency. The idea behind his project of reconstruction is not to enable one religion or one culture to conquer and subdue the rest of the world, nor is it to win the clash of civilizations on behalf of Islam. The purpose of an Islamic reconstruction for Iqbal is to make available to humanity as such exactly what it needs in a form that it can appreciate and embrace. Iqbal's passion for Islam is an expression of humanism at its best. Now here's the heart of the matter. Iqbal's work is of utmost relevance today because it can help us overcome the kind of thinking we find in such dangerous ideas as the clash of civilizations thesis. Iqbal can help us see that humanity is facing far bigger problems than the conflict between some narrow-minded Muslims and some equally narrow-minded Westerners. With Iqbal as our guide, we can transcend the parochial mindset that makes us approach our problems in terms of our loyalties to a particular nation-state, a race, an ethnicity, or a religious community. Iqbal can help us realize that human beings are pretty much the same everywhere. They face the same kinds of issues, have the same set of needs, and find satisfaction in the same kinds of solutions. By using Iqbal's insights, and more importantly, by applying his method and approach, we can locate the root causes of the contemporary crisis of civilization. As I've mentioned, the three main problems that humanity is facing today, political and economic inequality, environmental destruction, and violent conflict, are the same problems that humanity has been facing since the birth of civilization. However, Iqbal can help us see that two important changes mark our own specific situation. First, certain elements in modernity have led to a continued exacerbation of these problems at a scale never before seen in history. And second, certain elements in modernity have made it possible and even inevitable that we approach these problems from a human and planetary, and indeed a religious and spiritual perspective. For Iqbal, modernity has not only aggravated the problems to which Islam can contribute some form of solutions, but modernity can also highlight and empower certain positive and desirable tendencies within Islam that have either remained dormant so far or have not yet been fully realized. According to Iqbal, the real purpose of Islam has been only partially actualized in history up to this point. Modernity has brought to the fore not only new challenges and difficulties for Islam, but it is also offering Islam entirely new opportunities for realizing its dormant or partially realized possibilities. From Iqbal's viewpoint, that means I should stop. From Iqbal's viewpoint, modernity is forcing Islam to live up to its own highest potential, to face the challenge of living with courage and creativity during particularly interesting times. Insofar as modernity may be associated with what we call the West, Iqbal shows us that there is a significant degree of kinship between Islam, as he understands it, and certain elements in Western thought. He is well known for having claimed, correctly in my view, that the intellectual aspects of Western culture are only a further development of some of the most important phases of the culture of Islam. I believe that this judgment is not invalidated by Iqbal's trenchant criticisms of what he calls the dazzling exterior of Western culture. So here's my conclusion. The very fact that we are celebrating Iqbal Day by discussing the kinship in thought between Islam and the West indicates that we are extending and refining Iqbal's legacy by noticing that the difference or the contrast or the opposition between Islam and the West is not as hard as some people want it to be. It's quite soft. Given that today there is no lack of people who are trying their best to maintain and even harden that binary, and given the fact that this kind of opposition has mostly produced an increase in human suffering, we are clearly involved in something that has an immense positive value. Furthermore, when we identify a particular kind of opposition, a kind of opposition that is taken as a hard and strong opposition, and we soften it, this is something that allows us to recognize other such defects in human reasoning, which are also causing problems for the human race. The contemporary crisis of civilization itself could not have come about without this style of reasoning. Insofar as Iqbal's thought can help us identify these problematic aspects of human reasoning and help us overcome those, it can help us also to address the problems that are threatening to destroy civilization as such. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, too.